We're just going to give it a couple minutes to allow people to enter into the webinar here. So please be patient. We'll get started in just a minute or two. All right, we'll get started. So, good morning and thanks for joining us. My name is Kyle Koenen. I'm the policy director at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Before we get started on the substance, I want to just do a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, we'll hold a Q&A at the end of this webinar. If you have any questions at any point, there's a Q&A function down at the bottom. Please enter your questions there, and we will try and get to them. Second, today's discussion is going to be recorded and we will be posted to YouTube later today. So please feel free to share this far and wide with anyone in your network. Getting started here. In Wisconsin, our regulatory system really has grown steadily over time. Today, we're the 13th most regulated state in the country and the second most regulated in the Midwest, trailing only Illinois. That growth has real consequences. It shows up with higher costs, lower permitting, and less transparency for families and businesses. So that's why Will's partnered with lawmakers and a broad coalition of stakeholders to advance a set of reforms known as the Red Tape Reset Package. The goal of that package is pretty simple. We're looking to restore accountability and respect for the separation of powers, bring greater transparency and restraint back to the regulatory process, and reduce unnecessary barriers that stand in the way of people pursuing the American dream. Today's conversation is about what that really looks like in practice for a state that's followed through on a lot of these ideas. We're joined by Reeve Bull, who currently serves as Director of Virginia's Office of Regulatory Management under Governor Glenn Youngkin. In that role, Reeve is helping lead Virginia's regulatory modernization effort. The state has gone through and systematically reviewed its regulations, forced greater transparency into permitting, and tied rulemaking more closely to the clear statutory authority. Those reforms have produced measurable results, which we will cover extensively here, including cost savings and lower housing construction costs. So, Reeve's going to walk through how Virginia structured this work, what made it effective, and what lessons might be relevant for Wisconsin today as lawmakers considered the red tape reset. Reeve, thanks for being here with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kyle. And I'm delighted to be here today. And apologies in advance. I'm getting over a bit of a cold. So if my voice is a little compromised, that's why. But I'll try to get through this without too much coughing. What I'd like to do is kind of give some framework on sort of, why we did this reform initiative, what we've done, what we've accomplished, maybe what we've hoped to accomplish. There are a handful of things that I think we've achieved some pretty amazing results we would have liked to have done. Would be where we would focus our efforts if we had more time. And then I'd kind of like to bring it all together by sort of, I think that'll be a good segue, sort of looking at Wisconsin were to undertake a similar reform. What might that look like? What are the lessons we've learned and sort of what's the best way of structuring this sort of reform effort? So to start out, sort of why reform was needed. So, Kyle, you mentioned, Wisconsin is the 13th most regulated state, the second most regulated in the Midwest. Virginia, prior to our work, looked kind of similar to that. I forget where we ranked. I think somewhere in the middle. We were certainly among the more heavily regulated in the South. We tend to be in a pretty competitive neighborhood. So, North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia. These are all states that, were sort of moving in a good direction in terms of streamlining their regulations, whereas we haven't been. So there's really, really a lot of need. I think the formal number, we were at something like 120,000 regulatory requirements in the Mercatus database. My guess is Wisconsin's probably similar, maybe a few more. But what we've realized is that actually massively understated the problem. That's just the requirements in the actual text of the regulatory code. But what often happens, and I'll speak to this in more detail later, but in this regulatory code, there are often these things called incorporated documents, where agencies will say, instead of laying out the standard, they will just say, you comply with this privately developed standard. And when you add all of that up, it's almost three times as many requirements. It's closer to 335,000 in Virginia. My guess is you probably have a similar dynamic in Wisconsin. So that's maybe something to think about, as you start grappling with this problem. And in some ways, the regulatory burden is actually often even worse than what it may seem to be on paper. Other than that, though, like in many respects, Virginia's approach looked pretty decent on paper. Even before we came into office, all of our regulations were online. All of the guidance documents, at least the documents themselves, were online. The changes were not always online. There was a certain amount of cost benefit analysis that occurred. There was a requirement for a 4-year look back. Every 4 years, agencies had to go back and look at every regulation they had on the books. There was even a limited pilot program that was undertaken in 2018, where 2 agencies were tasked with streamlining their requirements by around 25%. So it wasn't for lack of effort. Virginia had done, I think, more than most states. But what was missing, and this is why I think our reform, has been so successful, and I think it's something that you should bear in mind as you consider doing something similar in Wisconsin, is there was no centralized oversight. There was no body in the governor's office, politically accountable body, or in the legislature for that matter, that could actually review what those agencies were doing. And so as a consequence, a lot of these things that were good on paper, like the limited cost benefit analysis or the 4-year look back, they just weren't happening. The 4-year look back, a lot of agencies just weren't doing it. Those that were just checking a box and just saying, okay, yeah, we still need that regulation. Almost never did they actually go back and, substantively review everything and determine, is this still needed? Do the cost and the benefits still make sense? So having that centralized oversight, I think, is what has really been the game changer. And so when we created our office, our goals were not necessarily all that different from what existed previously. The difference was really that you had somebody to provide that oversight and that input. So, our overall goals were really pretty simple. One, we wanted to make the process more transparent. Two, we wanted to have universal cost benefit analysis of everything, every regulation and guidance documents. And then three, we wanted to reduce regulatory requirements by 25%. Set a clear goal of a 25% reduction. And so, those were our, sorry, give me a second here. Apologies again. So those were basically our overall goals. And we then set about systematically accomplishing those goals and basically giving agencies the resources that they needed in order to achieve them. So the first thing that we did with respect to the transparency was we said, okay, every single regulation, even those that are technically exempt under the Administrative Process Act, as well as every single change to a guidance document, has to appear on a publicly available website. And that website already existed. So that was fairly easy to basically get everything up there comprehensively. Second thing that we did is, we tasked the agencies with doing cost benefit analysis. We tasked them with achieving the 25% reduction, but we didn't leave them to their own devices to do that, because what we had seen in the past, especially like in this pilot program I mentioned, is if you don't give the agencies any resources, then you get just massive variation in terms of how they approach it. So I actually wrote, that was my first assignment when I started as deputy under Andrew Wheeler. I actually wrote a cost benefit analysis manual that laid out in detail here's how you do the cost benefit analysis. It's closely based on the federal process, Circular A4, and we gave agencies that resource. Second thing that I did is wrote a guide on regulatory reduction. Here's what's a regulatory requirement. Here's what counts as reducing a regulatory requirement. Um, that too brought greater standardization to the process. And then we did some trainings with the agencies where we actually sat down, went to the agencies and went over, here's how we want you to do this analysis. Here's what we're looking for. And what we found is that the agencies actually asked some really good questions. One of the questions that we got, for instance, was, what happens if I change a regulation? I'm actually adding words to it, but I'm actually reducing the burden. So to give you an example, like if there are two ways to qualify for a particular profession, get a bachelor's degree and 1 year experience or a master's degree and 0 years of experience. If I add a third option, which is get a high school degree and maybe 2 years of experience, is that is that a reduction? And the answer is almost certainly yes. You're opening a new avenue to actually get into the profession, but you're actually adding words to the code. And so, there were questions like that we had to grapple with that I think made this a lot more successful than past efforts have been. Because I feel like past efforts have really just sort of focused on how many words are you cutting, how many regulations are you cutting. We've certainly done that. We've got a significant number of words and a significant number of requirements. We've also done a handful of things that really meaningfully reduce the burdens in a way that don't necessarily involve cutting words or cutting requirements. And I'll give you an example. So our board for barbers and cosmetology, one of their major regulatory reforms was they looked at the number of training hours that are required. And at the time, it was 1,500 hours to become a cosmetologist. And they looked at that and they said, well, that's too high. We think 1,500 hours is excessive. They looked at some other states and they decided, 1,500 is just too high. So we're going to go down to 1,000. Now, I personally probably would have gone even further. My personal view is that we probably should not be regulating things like that. And, in a perfect world, you might actually deregulate professions completely. But I think everybody would agree that going from 1,500 hours down to 1,000 hours is a real improvement. But you haven't eliminated a requirement. The requirement is still there. It's just a different number of hours. So what we ultimately did is say, okay, we're going to give the agency partial credit for that reduction. From 1,500 down to 1,000 means that you're cutting by a third the amount of time that's required to enter that profession. And there are increased earnings and other benefits associated with that. So if the agency can actually calculate that, can monetize that, then we will give the agency partial credit for that change. So that's ultimately what we did. And I'll get to our overall statistics in a minute, but the overall statistics are going to reflect a combination of things. In some cases, it is actually just cutting, full requirements out of the code. And in other cases, it's reducing the burden in a particular way. And, we then give the agency credit for that. It seems simple, seems straightforward, but I really feel like that has been one of the major drivers of our success because I just don't think it's been done that way in the past. And I think allowing that greater flexibility ensures that you're really focused on the bottom line. And the bottom line shouldn't really be how many requirements you have. The bottom line should be, are we meaningfully reducing burdens or not? And there are a variety of ways to do that. And I think our resources really get at that, such that if a state were to replicate our initiative, they could similarly integrate that sort of innovative framework in how they address this. Final thing that came up is how do you address guidance documents? Guidance documents, so-called regulatory dark matter, uh, have proliferated and proliferated over the years. They're often misused. It's not technically by law. An agency is not allowed to put a binding obligation in a guidance document, and that is often honored in the breach. It's not infrequent that an agency will issue what it calls a guidance document, but it has mandatory language. It says you shall do X, Y, and Z. So the first thing we said is you have to get all of those actual requirements out of guidance documents. If it's a requirement, then it either needs to be in a regulation or you just need to eliminate it. So that was sort of the first thing. No more requirements in guidance documents. And the second thing we did in terms of the 25% reduction is said that we want to reduce the length of guidance documents by at least 25%. So we said essentially, tabulated the total number of words, and then that number has to be reduced by at least a fourth. So you look at words rather than requirements because technically they're not supposed to have requirements. And if they do have requirements, then those should be eliminated, or if they really need to keep it, move it to a regulation. So that was kind of the overall framework. I'll just really briefly talk about kind of the nuts and the bolts of how we implemented it. So if you were looking to do a similar reform, I think this is sort of what it would look like. So first, we released all of those resources, the economic analysis manual, the reduction guide, a handful of other things, a form for agencies to use to actually do cost-benefit analysis. Second thing we then did is, as part of those cost-benefit analyses, agencies were required to report to us every single time they cut a requirement, every single time they added a requirement, and then they had to calculate the costs and benefits associated with that. So that's allowed us to track everything, because starting in late 2022, every single change an agency has made is now being tracked. Third thing we then do is we started to track those changes and put together an Excel spreadsheet. So we basically took every single agency, where did they start? How many requirements did they have? How many words and guidance documents did they have? And we started to track either increases or decreases over time. And then this was internal, but we color coded it as red, yellow, or green. Red meant that the agency actually increased requirements. Yellow meant that it reduced it, but not by the targeted amount. And then green was, 25% or more. And then what we did is we had some intermediate goals where I think our first year we were looking for a 10% cut by the end of the year. Second year, 20% cut, and then final year get to 25. So breaking it down that way, I think, was also helpful. It sort of gave the agencies something to work towards and something where we could say either you're on track or you're not on track. We also asked the agencies to tell us, to project forward in the next year, what do you anticipate removing? And then you could track that. Are they actually doing what they said? Or are they, kind of flouting the objective? So, bottom line, I think, is that accountability is really key. I'm as skeptical as anybody of, sort of the likelihood that bureaucracies will embrace a regulatory modernization initiative. But I've honestly been very pleasantly surprised that if you set a clear goal, you give people the resources they need to reach that goal, you track progress towards that goal over time, and then you continue to hold people accountable, that I think you can get some really amazing results. And that's what I'd like to transition to next, actually describe the results that we've been able to achieve. So we're now basically at the end of the initiative. My last day will be a week from tomorrow. So, this may change a bit, but this is basically where we ended up in terms of the overall results we've achieved in about 3.5 years. So first of all, because we could track the cost savings, we can determine the overall uh, reduced cost of bureaucracy effectively associated with all of the changes in aggregate. And when you add all of that up, it's $1.4 billion per year saved as a result of the reforms that we undertook. Of that 1.4 billion, a big chunk of it, more than half, is a result of changes to the building code. So the building code is actually one of these incorporated documents that I referred to earlier. If you go to try to find the building code in your regulation, my guess is you probably can't because it's actually a private document that's being incorporated. But basically, every 3 years, this privately developed document gets updated. And a lot of the stuff is good. It's what you'd expect. It's the 2x4, the 2x4s have to be spaced at the following intervals. The pipe coming into the house has to be this particular diameter. Stuff that goes to the soundness or structural integrity of the house. You don't want to mess with it. But there's also a lot of gold plating that gets put in. There's a lot of sort of like energy efficiency stuff and really just things that are rather unnecessary that builders, may actually like because, increasing the construction cost may actually be beneficial in terms of their bottom line. But they have the effect of increasing the cost of housing, constantly increasing the cost of housing over time. So what we did is, our housing agency, in a very rigorous and detailed way, went through every single line of that thing. And basically anything that was gold plating, they proposed just stripping. We weren't able to cut everything, but a lot of it we were able to cut. There were a handful of things we actually threw in that increased the cost, so those were relatively minimal. But when you add it all up, we were able to cut about $24,000 off the construction cost of a new house, which is significant. If you're looking to buy a house, especially a starter house, that is a major benefit in terms of money that goes back in your pocket. And when you take that 24,000 and multiply it out by the 30,000 new houses on average per year constructed in Virginia, it comes up to around $723 million per year, so about half of the 1.4 billion. Another big chunk of the savings were related to improvements to occupational licensing. So things like cutting the number of training hours that I mentioned earlier, things like moving to universal licensing, where if you were coming in from another state, you could just practice in Virginia. You don't have to go through an additional state-specific process. Things like simply speeding up the licensing process. We're able to get the average review time down from 33 days down to about 5 days. So people get their license almost a month faster. And when they get to work faster, then there are increased earnings associated with that. So you add all of that up and it's over $200 million per year that we've saved working professionals by a whole suite of reforms to those regulations. And then the final big bucket, which is also 200 million or more per year, is from reforms to the environmental permitting process. A big thing that we've done is looked at moving from so-called individual permits, which are highly detailed, require site-specific determinations, to general permits, which are more like a driver's license, basically. As long as you meet all of the criteria, then you receive the permit. We massively simplified our stormwater handbook. We took something that was a guidance document that was about 23 inches if you added up all the paper, and we've gotten it down to 5 inches. And we put it on an app that you can actually, just easily access now. So that saves people a ton of time. It's a lot faster now to get the stormwater permit. And if you look at expediting the construction associated with that, there's a significant savings associated with that. So that kind of gives you some flavor of, what we were able to achieve and where the big cost savings were. One thing, and I'll emphasize this more at the end, but if you think about what we did, these are not politically controversial things. We weren't out there slashing environmental regulations or slashing, workplace safety regulations. And I think that's important, especially in a relatively purple state, like Wisconsin or like Virginia. Um, there's a whole lot of low hanging fruit here, a whole lot of red tape where it's not a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. It's really just making the process work more effectively. We could sit here and argue about how strict environmental regulations should be. I may personally be in favor of, very aggressive rethinking in that space. But, given political realities, that may not be feasible. And that's where I think there's still just an enormous amount of low hanging fruit that could be picked. And I think that's perhaps the most exciting aspect of this because it doesn't have to be controversial if done properly. Uh, a few other statistics just for your awareness. So I said we wanted to cut 25% in terms of the regulatory requirements. We are currently sitting at a 35.7% streamlining, so we really blew through the original goal of 25. Guidance documents, we're able to go even further. We're sitting at a 49+% reduction there. For context, that's almost 12 million words we've cut from guidance documents, which, if you're familiar with the book War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, it's about 20 times the length of War and Peace, or 15 times the length of the King James Bible. So that gives you some sense of just the amount of text that we've been able to cut. And honestly, I think we could go even further. But at least to date, that's what we've been able to achieve. Final thing I'll mention on the results front, and I can't, draw a causal connection here. I think that will, require further study. But over the course of these 4 years that we've been undertaking these reforms, Virginia has soared, especially in terms of the business climate. We've attracted well north of $100 billion in new capital investment. I think it's sitting around 150 or 160 last I checked, which really dwarfs any prior administration in terms of the amount of new investment that's been achieved. We've created hundreds of thousands of new jobs. I think it's pretty close to 300,000 at last count. And another thing that the governor is very, focused on is we've actually gone from a state that loses people every year, there's net out migration, to starting in 2023, a state with net in migration. So more people are now choosing to call Virginia home as opposed to choosing to leave Virginia. So again, I can't draw a direct link between the two, but I think they all go together. I think that the regulatory reform and the other reform, education reform, public safety reform, things that we've undertaken have made Virginia a place where people want to live. Or as the governor puts it, it's made it a good place to live, work, and raise a family. And that's really the overall, goal that sort of drives everything that we do. So let me also take just a few minutes. So I focused exclusively on regulation to this point. But sort of the other major pillar of our success has been in the permitting space. In Virginia, and I imagine this is true of Wisconsin as well, when we came into office, the permitting process was really a black box. You would apply for a permit, you would have no idea where it sat in the process, you would have no idea how long it's going to take to receive the permit. It was just completely unpredictable. So when we came into office, we said, we want to change that. These days, you could track just about everything online. You order a pizza from Domino's, it tells you exactly where it is in the process, when you can expect it. Same thing if you order a FedEx package or an Uber. So we wanted to bring that same level of transparency to permitting, to make it where you could track, in high level of detail where the permit actually is in the process. So we launched a permitting dashboard And Kyle, apologies, this is not a link that I gave you. I'll send this separately, but it's permits.virginia.gov, and it's an online portal uh, that has now every single multi-step permit application in the state. So if you've applied for a multi-step permit, you could just log on permits.virginia.gov and you can go find it. And it's going to break the permit down into a series of Gantt charts that tell you what the individual steps are, who's responsible for those steps, how long it's supposed to take, how long it's actually taking. So it gives you just this extraordinary level of insight into the process in a way that it's not a black box anymore. It's actually very open, very transparent. And what we found is just the transparency alone has been a game changer. We haven't necessarily, we have, reformed permits in various ways, as I mentioned earlier, but the most comprehensive thing we did is just took the existing permits and put them all up online. And the results have been huge. So our Department of Environmental Quality, which is like our EPA, uh, as a result of this initiative, has actually cut its processing times by 65%. So it takes about a third the amount of time now to get a DEQ permit as it did before. There are 9 other agencies on VPT. Of those additional agencies, at least 4 of them have achieved a 20% or more reduction. And the others are, tracking reasonably well also. We're seeing just these massive, massive reductions in processing times. That makes sense. If it's a black box, then there's no accountability. But if you put it online, there is accountability. And then there's an additional element to it. The online piece I think is key, but there's also a back end program that only the agencies can access. And that gives even greater granularity. Like it will tell you, for instance, who's responsible in the agency for that particular step. So it's also a management tool where if somebody's underperforming, the agency can go in and give the coaching that's necessary. What is also interestingly uncovered, and I think part of the 65% reduction in DEQ in particular as a result of this, is that there was a certain degree of disproportion among different offices. Northern Virginia offices were getting a huge number of permit applications, whereas Southern Virginia offices were getting relatively few. So some offices were overbooked, others were kind of coasting. And what this transparency allowed was for the agency now to go in and fix that, actually reallocate work in a way that's fairer among the different offices so that everybody is performing more effectively. So bottom line is, it really has fundamentally changed things. And it's the sort of thing that any state could do. It really wasn't that complicated. In fact, all of our agencies had different permitting processes. And we were able to design the system in a way that didn't matter. As long as you have sort of like a single ingest point, you can pull in an Excel sheet, you can pull in an online database. It doesn't really matter how you structure it, as long as the top level is pulling in all of the data. So I think it's something that another state can replicate very, very easily. So in the limited time that I have left, let me do just 2 things. One, want to sort of briefly talk about what's next. And for Virginia, it'll of course be up to the next administration, how much of this they continue to move forward with. One thing that we are doing that I think shows a lot of promise is actually using artificial intelligence to further supercharge our efforts. So we're working with a small vendor that has designed a really cool application that can do a handful of things. It can basically take the state statutes and the regulations and compare them to each other and identify where the regulation goes beyond the statute. So it helps identify basically changes that you can make without legislation, that you can actually implement a regulatory fix. It can compare the regulation to itself or to other agencies' regulations and identify duplication. So if there are multiple different regulations covering the same thing, uh, that may or may not be in tension with each other, then you can then streamline all of that. It can do a preliminary cost benefit analysis, which I think does a pretty good job. It goes to the website, the web, and pulls public sources. It's not a cost benefit analysis that you would necessarily want to rely definitively on. It's something that a human would definitely need to review. What I think is really amazing about it is that it shows you where the cost drivers are. And that's something that would have been enormously valuable to us had we had that at the outset. We were kind of flying blind to some extent in terms of, we had a general sense from stakeholders, where the big costs were. But we didn't have like a comprehensive analysis of the entire code to say, okay, here are where the big costs lie. This tool can actually do that preliminary analysis. So you can go in and, produce like a heat map basically that tells you where you might want to focus your time. And then the final thing it can do is actually comparative analysis, where it can go in and say, okay, your state does X, your surrounding states do the following. So the cosmetology example, I think, sort of perfectly illustrates that. We didn't use AI for this, but the tool could actually say, okay, Virginia's at 1,500 hours, North Carolina's at, let's say, 1,200, Tennessee's at 1,000. And then it could even go further afield and say the lowest number, and I'm just making this up, is Wyoming, and it is at 500. So it will tell you all of that. And to me, that's really, really powerful evidence that if your state is a lot heavier, especially compared to your surrounding states, but if it's, just more heavy generally than other states, then that's really, really good evidence that you might want to go in and rethink that and either deregulate or at the very least, streamline the associated burden. So to conclude, let me just sort of hit a few points where I think we've learned a lot of lessons over the last 3.5 years, and I think that hopefully our experience can be helpful to Wisconsin in that respect. So first of all, and I'll kind of sag from my previous set of comments, is I would start with the artificial intelligence analysis. We were not able to do that. The technology just did not exist in 2022. But if I were doing this now, I would definitely start by going in and doing just a comprehensive AI analysis of the entire corpus. Here's where the big costs are. Do the comparative analysis. For the big cost ones, here's how the other states approach the same problem. Here's where there's duplication. Here's where your agencies have overlap among each other. Produce that entire comprehensive analysis, and then basically work with the agencies to implement the appropriate revisions. For us, we really had to rely on the agencies to come to us and stakeholders and other people who were affected by the regulation. That's still important, and you should definitely still do that as well. But I think the AI gives you just this incredibly powerful tool that we did not have. And I think will make this sort of effort even easier going forward. Another thing to keep in mind, and I know when I speak in other states, the major concern is how much does this cost? What would it take to implement this sort of reform? In our case, not a lot. There are 4 of us in the Office of Regulatory Management. Our collective salaries are well below $1 million. So the return on investment, I think, is huge. But I think AI brings the cost down even further. It brings the cost down and it increases the footprint. Like I in my office have not been able to go in and comprehensively audit the entire regulatory code just because we don't have time, we don't have people to do that. But AI can do that. And AI can really, I think, take, whatever human resources you can dedicate to it and really just expand that multiple fold in terms of the results that can be achieved. Second lesson I would highlight is don't reinvent the wheel. I think that these resources that Virginia has produced are um, pretty translatable to another context. And we would be absolutely delighted if another state were to plagiarize us. Just basically take that manual, use it exactly as is if you like, or if you want to modify it and update it for your state, certainly feel free to do that as well. Um, but we perceive it as a big part of our legacy, how other states sort of take what we've done and run with it. So please feel free to use whatever resources we've created, and I am happy to be a resource as well. As this moves forward, I transition into my next role. I think that I'd love to, collaborate on these sorts of reforms. Final lesson that I'll mention, and this is sort of what to avoid, and I'll allude back to something I said earlier, and that is, you're a purple state. We too are a purple state in Virginia, so it's really important how you characterize this. If you characterize it as sort of a Doge type, regulatory slashing initiative, that's going to get a different reaction than if you characterize it as something that's really focused just on modernizing, on streamlining, on updating, and on making the process more transparent. And in terms of what we did, it's really that. It's transparency, it's cutting red tape, it's updating regulations in a way that gets rid of burdens that are pretty indefensible. They're the sorts of things that I don't think anybody left, right, or center would say, no, we needed to keep these restrictions in place. We've really been able to identify a lot of reforms that I think are just very nonpartisan. So, especially in Wisconsin, I would recommend you keep that in mind in terms of promoting this initiative. That it's really about good government. It's about making the process more transparent, more open, more efficient, and there's really just an enormous opportunity. I think the 1.4 billion speaks to that, but honestly, I think a state could probably go even further, especially using AI to help identify streamlining opportunities. So let me stop there. I would be happy to answer any questions people have.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A. We got a few minutes left here. I'll ask a question. I guess you had mentioned that the original goal that you had set was 25%. You exceeded 35%. What was kind of the catalyst for getting over the hump there and kind of supercharging that effort? Was it the AI adoption, or were you ahead of track before you even had that tool?
Yeah. All right. So yeah, no, great question. Yeah, apologies. This really kind of breaking out. ah, sorry. So yeah, so it was pre-AI, though I feel like the AI, if we had more time, we could probably go even beyond the 35%. But yeah, I think one big catalyst was basically uh, being sorry.
I'll let you catch your breath there for a second. Take your time.
Sorry, give me a second.
Yeah. While Reeve's doing that too, I think one of the other follow-up questions I was going to have for him as well is obviously the Office of Regulatory Management in Virginia is an executive branch agency. As far as structure goes, while you're thinking about that one too, Reeve, is there any value in having that in the executive branch, or as states consider a similar reform, kind of what are the pluses and minuses of executive branch versus a legislative like service agency or something along those lines?
Yeah, and both great questions. So, answering them in the order uh, presented. So the first one, I mean, I think that sort of a major uh, shift for us was when we realized just how many uh, requirements are in these so-called incorporated documents. That's something I didn't realize going into the process. And a big part of the cuts are in the building code that I alluded to earlier, as well as our Department of Transportation, which I did not mention, has been able to cut like tens of thousands of requirements from various uh, incorporated documents where either they just really weren't using it at all, or they were using it, but it was designed in this exceedingly confusing way where you would have like 10 documents that are 500 pages each. And they would really only intend that you comply with like one tiny little piece of that. Um, the way they structured it, it was essentially saying you had to comply with everything. And you can imagine from like a small business perspective, how utterly confusing that is. To log onto a website to see just this mass of documents and not really know whether you have to comply or not. So I think that ended up, especially for small business, making things a lot more efficient, and that was sort of a major source of cuts. A lot of our cuts are either a result of those incorporated documents that we're able to clean up, or significant savings associated with streamlining burdens. Um, on your second question, and that's something that I've given a lot of thought to because we are kind of unique in the sense that we are created via executive order, not by statute, and we exist within the governor's office. Um, could you structure it a different way? I think so. I think that depending on the political dynamic of your individual state, I think having something in the legislature or having something that's more independent uh, is almost certainly fine. I don't think it really matters so much where it's housed. I think what's the most important is that you have some sort of centralized body that has that oversight. What I would not recommend is creating like a career bureaucracy, staff agency with this goal, because then you'll just end up with more sort of paper compliance, which I think is where a lot of states' efforts have foundered. I mean, a lot of them do have a budgetary office that has some role that's somewhat similar to this, uh, but they've not been able to achieve much progress. And I think the reason why is you need a central body and you need something that's politically accountable, that works either with the governor or the legislature or both, and can really provide that sort of independent oversight into the process. But in terms of how exactly you structure it or where you place it, I don't think that's critically important.
All right, one last question here before we let everyone go. I guess since you're in the waning days of the administration here, what do you kind of expect as the legacy of this moving forward? What do you think will continue on? Where do you see there might be some changes with the new governor coming in?
Yeah, so it's ultimately up to them, in terms of what aspects, of our work, move forward. I think though that, especially on the transparency front, I think putting that permitting dashboard out there, making the regulations available, making the process open and participatory, those strike me as good government reforms that I think have really been integrated now into the process. And I would hope will continue. I think that there's um, an enormous amount to be said for having a process that's open, that involves public input and that is, as accessible as possible. And I think that's the sort of thing that, I think should, continue to be part of the process. I should also mention, I think it's something that all of the reforms that we've undertaken, I think, have garnered a lot of interest. There seems to be interest in other states. There seems to be some interest in the federal government. I've even spoken with people overseas, different countries that are adopting, various regulatory reform initiatives, and they're very interested, especially on the AI front, how we've been able to use technology to accelerate our work. So I think the reforms, will live on. I think it's the sort of initiative that I think really should not be perceived as a black and white issue. I think it's the sort of thing that makes government more efficient, makes the process work better, and that reformers that are interested in making their state more competitive, I think will find this sort of thing to be very valuable.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for taking the time out today. We will follow up after this with a video link of this webinar along with the documents that Reeve shared with us. My email will be on there as well. If you have any follow-up questions, I can definitely get those to Reeve. And appreciate the discussion today. And hopefully we can take a lot of the lessons learned here and put them into action here in Wisconsin. Thanks, Reeve.
Thank you.